Yeah, okay. All right, so I am, as the graduate coordinator, I'm responsible both for our research programs and in a general sense for our professional programs. So I've included both of them on this slide because some of you may also be interested in the professional program here, but this open house is specifically tailored to research programs, meaning the PhD and the MSCF. But I wanted to just say a word or two about the MFC program, the Masters in Forest Conservation, the professional program, in case some of you are also interested in that, or maybe somebody by mistake is in this session. So I just want to point that out. If you're interested in both, potentially, let me just briefly say that the MFC program is a course-based program that's not focused on research per se. It's designed to provide training that would set you up for a career in forestry. It's a course-based program. It's a cohort-based program, meaning that an incoming group of students go through the program together, take the same courses. And as you can see from this slide here, it's a 1.5-year program. So you start in the fall, do courses in the fall and the winter, and then there's a summer internship program, which is sort of a key component, which provides you with not only field experience, but professional experience, because you do the internship with a host organization that would provide you with professional experience that might set you up well for getting a job after you finish, which doesn't happen until after the fall of the second year. So it's a 1.5-year program. Anyways, if you're also interested in that program, potentially, there is a separate open house for that in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, November 21st at 4 o'clock. This is from the website. You can find it there. So if you're interested in that program, you can attend that instead. Yeah, so just to contrast, just to reiterate what I said, the contrast between the program is that the Masters in Forest Conservation does not have a specific research focus, whereas the MSCF and the PhD program do. So here's a brief distinction between those two programs. These are our two research stream programs. You probably have a general sense of what the difference is between a master's and a PhD. One takes longer than the other, obviously. The reason being that the PhD has 4 courses, whereas the master's program has 2 courses. That's one of the reasons. But the main difference being is that it's just there's more. The PhD program requires more time to do more research in depth. Just so, for example, typically a master's project will result in 1 publication, whereas a PhD will result in multiple publications. And of course, that takes time to do the research, but also takes time to get through the courses and take the various exams and do the various defenses. The main difference between the two is that you have a qualifying exam in the PhD, which you don't have in the master's, which is sort of a preliminary stepping stone. It's supposed to be done in the first year or 2. It's meant to test your ability, your knowledge of the field in general, your ability to draft a research proposal. And it's really sort of a hoop that you have to jump through to make sure you're ready to, start the research in all seriousness and do the research and defend it. There's also 2 defenses associated with the PhD, whereas there's only 1 defense associated with the master's. And lastly, the PhD has to be defended to an external examiner, as well as a committee that's that's part of the process all along. I hope you guys can see the title slide on my thing, because I can't, but there's something in the way. Just give me. There we go. I got it out of the way. Okay, so One thing I want to point out here about our research program is that forestry is an interdisciplinary field. So that means that you can do a PhD in forestry that is either a social science based thesis, something like economics, or something that's more in the natural sciences, so something like more biology and oriented, or it could even be engineering oriented, so like wood science, for example. But we are, being in Daniels, we also have a strong connection to the building sciences as well. So some students interested in building science, for example, building tall buildings with wood, are not only interested in wood science, but it's sort of the building science side of things. And so they sometimes do their PhD in forestry. So just so you know, you've probably already been snooping around the website looking for potential supervisors, but if you haven't, this is the place to go. You'll see there's a variety of different people you could work with, including some cross-appointed people, and there's also some people in Daniels that you could potentially work with, like building sciences, that aren't on this list. And I put this up here because the most important thing to recognize is that your success in getting into the program and your success as a research stream student depends almost entirely on your supervisor and finding the right supervisor. And so, the best thing you can do to get into the program, if that's what you want, is to find the right supervisor and get them on board. That's really more important than writing a good letter or whatever else might influence your success of your application. Really, the most important thing by far is finding a supervisor who is willing to support your application. So there are a number of specific openings that are posted here on this website. So if any of this interests you, then I would suggest you contact those people. That said, if a particular person's advertised project doesn't quite fit your interests, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be interested in supporting you to do something related or even slightly different from what they do in general. So don't assume that in order to work with one of these professors, you have to do exactly what's listed there. The main thing is that there's some overlap, but more importantly, just that they're interested in supporting you in whatever you choose you want to do. Just to hit this point home that contacting a supervisor is the most important thing, let me just point out that supervisors contribute to the funding package that is provided to students. This table here, this excerpt of the funding package table, you may have seen this on the website. Just pointing out here that of the a portion, approximately half of the funds that go to supporting students are provided by the supervisor. So obviously, if you don't have a supervisor, then you can't. There's not enough funding to support you. So this is distinct in case you've looked into the PhD program in architecture. This is as distinct from that. So that's important to point out here. I'll talk a little bit more about the funding package a little bit later. Anyway, so the point is contact a supervisor if you haven't, a potential supervisor if you haven't already, and try to secure their support for your application. There's really no point in applying if you don't have a potential supervisor. You can do it. Some people apply and then hope somebody will, pick up their application and take an interest, but that doesn't happen very often. The other thing to recognize that you have to meet the minimum standards to be admitted. So even if you have a supervisor who is interested, but you don't meet the minimum standards set by the School of Graduate Studies, then you're not going to be admitted unless an exception is made, which hopefully is not the case and is not made very often. So for the master's degree, what you need is at least a mid-B grade point average in the final year of your undergrad. What you need for the PhD is an A- average in your from your master's degree. And in both cases, you need to have done, if you're an international student, there might be issues associated with which institutions qualify, and I can talk about that at the end if we have any international students. The deadline is listed here. Technically, there's only one final deadline, which is March 28th. In other words, if you applied by March 28th, you've met the deadline and you can be considered. But there's one earlier technically two earlier deadlines. Let's say a set of January deadlines that you should apply for if you're interested, because you have to apply by January in order to be considered for graduate scholarships. So you should apply early, and frankly, most supervisors want to identify their students early. So you should do that. And you're ahead of the game. If you're here today with us, you're already thinking about this. So there's no reason you wouldn't apply by January 6th. Just to note, there's actually kind of two deadlines. One is to submit your payment and your transcripts, and then you can wait another week, January 13th, to get all the actual documents online. And here's I won't talk much about this right now, at least. The package for your application consists of a CV. You have to find 3 people who are willing to write letters of reference, and I recommend that you make sure that you try as best as you can to find people who can speak from some experience, as opposed to just a professor that you may have had just once who may not remember you. Try and assess what kind of letter they're going to write, and pick the best people that you can. You also have to write a statement of interest about why you're applying, what kind of research you're interested in, why it's a good fit with your potential supervisor, and then also provide a writing sample that you've written somewhere along your studies that just shows what you're capable of. And then lastly, there's two items at the bottom are relevant only to international students. If you're international students, you need to take a test to establish what your English proficiency is, and then also depending depending on where you come from, you have to make sure that your degree. Basically there's a conversion. So when I talked about these minimum grade point averages, there's a conversion that has to happen for international degrees to make sure they are actually equivalent. So there's this tool that's available online that can tell you if your grade point average from such and such a country, whether it meets the minimum standard I mentioned before. Okay, and then lastly, a few other items about just the difference between the two programs. As I mentioned before, the PhD is more involved, but to be a little more specific, it's typically a 4 to 5 year effort, whereas the master's program usually takes about 2 years. Sometimes it's a little bit less, and there is actually pressure to finish up as soon as possible. The reason being, the guaranteed funding for master's students is only 1 year, whereas the PhD program is 4. And so for the master's, this creates some pressure because it's hard to do research in a year. And so typically master's students are, continuing to write up and defend beyond the first guaranteed year of funding. Now, that said, supervisors, if they know this, and they often will commit to, maybe not up front, but they will provide funding to master's students until they finish. But that's something you have to discuss with your potential supervisor. The same is true sort of the PhD program. You can wrap up in 4 years if you're very efficient. Sometimes it takes longer, and if that 5th year you don't have guaranteed funding. But again, supervisors will often extend the funding, maybe not the same amount as originally, but they will try to cover that over that little period. And let's see, I think there was something else I was going to say about, the guaranteed funding. So, one last thing. Supervisors, there's the guaranteed funding is the minimum. So if you're accepted, you will get the minimum. Sometimes not only will supervisors extend it beyond the 1st year or the 4th year in the case of those 2 programs, but they might actually top up the minimum funding, providing more funding. I would say that happens, in maybe 50% of the cases, and that that depends on whether or not the supervisor has the funds. This has become more of an issue in recent years as living expenses have gone up. But that's something you should know. So that if you're concerned about that, that's something you have to discuss with your potential supervisor. Okay, I'm going to unshare my screen, stop sharing. Well, maybe I won't stop sharing, but I will. So I'm going to have, I see that there's somebody. That's an old message, I assume. Okay, I was just looking at the text message. I'm going to let James talk about his experience as a PhD student, but before doing that, I thought I would, just open the floor to any questions people might have based on what I said. Does anybody in the audience there want to ask a question about the programs? I'll be available after James speaks as well, but let me know if you have something, follow-up question based on what I just presented.
Okay, John. Well, if there's no follow-up questions at the moment, I could start my presentation over here.
Okay.
So yeah, welcome to the open session for prospective forestry students. It's great to see your names here, at least. My name's James Marcucci. I'm a 2nd-year PhD student within the Institute of Forestry and Conservation. And I'm here to talk about my experiences as a research student at the Daniels faculty. So just to give you a bit of my experience at U of T, I've done my undergrad, master's, and currently doing my PhD at U of T. During my master's, I did my master's of forest conservation at U of T. So it's not the MSc research stream. It was more the course-based stream that John was talking about earlier. And I found that my campus experience at U of T has been different at each stage of my educational experience. During my master's, I did it online, so I felt like there's a few months of growing pains for the teachers and students, but it was quite the intensive experience to do the master's partly online. But on campus here, particularly within the forestry building, it's stewed in a lot of history, and there's actually different parts of the building have a bit of separation from the forestry building. So there's the Mass Timber Institute, that's part of the forestry building, which is quite cool. And that has to do with dealing with wooden buildings, something that John touched on. And there's also the Toronto Ravine Revitalization Strategy folks in the building as well. And so just the campus experience that I've had has been very pleasant. Being down at St. George campus now that the King's College Circle has finished its construction, it's quite pleasant. And there are a variety of libraries. Obviously, we have Robarts Library, which is our largest, but then there's Gerstein, and within the Forestry building, within Daniels, it also has its own library that is quite good when it comes to accessing data for mapping and stuff like that. I'm doing my PhD in urban forest stewardship, mapping, and analysis. So that's more on the social science side of things rather on the hard science side of things. And one of the experiences of just being at U of T is just the diversity of different programs going on within the forestry building. John listed out all those professors and all their specialities. Here's something that my supervisor, Dr. Daniela Perch-Mandanovich, does in the Lake Simcoe region, and she focuses on VSP procedures, so vegetative sampling protocol procedures in the Lake Simcoe area, and she wants to standardize a way in which the vegetation is mapped, and also standardize a way in which private landowners are engaged with to ensure that these watersheds are taken care of, so that places like the city of Toronto are working well from a watershed perspective. But there's also a variety of other programs, or I guess specialities that professors have, and it lends itself well to quite a diversity of experience. And depending on what you're looking for, whether it's on the urban forest side, kind of like hard forestry research, forest fire, invasive species pest management, predicting habitation zones from climate change, you name it. And I feel like the forestry program does it. And so, the coursework and the research development process for MSCs and PhDs is structured in a way where you get your coursework done in the first year or two of your program, more so the first year for MSCs and definitely the first year or two for PhDs. And the coursework, especially for the PhDs, is designed to cater towards your needs. So you have to complete 2 full credits. Only half of the credit is compulsory. The other 1.5 credits are courses that you choose between you and your supervisor. And often some of these coursework can be to improve your statistical or spatial analytical abilities, but some of it can be catered towards your actual research beyond just your technical skills. So here you see a picture of one of our professors, Sean Thomas, working on top of a roof in the Daniels building. And he's working on putting sedum in that rooftop garden over there. And he's working on using biochar as a remediation in urban areas. And so there's a quite a intensive relationship that you have with your supervisor within the program, especially for PhDs. I find that it's great to know your supervisor well, but it's also good to establish a good dialogue of conversation where you can have back and forth about your research ideas and what you think is feasible. Because often as PhD students, and I found this in my first year, you come in very ambitious. You come in with this idea that you're going to get your proposal done right away and you're going to, bang out 3 papers. But you have to kind of take a step back and realize what is feasible within 2 years if you're an MSc, or what is feasible within 4 years as a PhD. And within the program itself, John touched upon that there's some base funding that is covered uh, if you're accepted in the program, but there's also lots of opportunities to teach and mentor through either TA experiences here. So here, this is actually a photo, and I believe it's in Mattawa, of a bunch of MSCs and MFC students with a TA, but also with some of their professors here, like Ann Coven, Ben Kuttner. I think Tony Ung is there as well. And essentially, I find that, yes, U of T is heavy on the theoretical side, but especially within the forestry program, there's a lot of chances to go in the field or earn money through being a TA. And even particularly for me, I'm also working part-time for Natural Resources Canada. And so that work is tangentially tied towards my PhD, but I got the job essentially through my master's work. And my supervisor, Professor Daniela Perch-Mandanovich, got me that job through my master's program, and I had the opportunity to work for the National Capital Region for 2 years within NRCan. And now I have the awesome opportunity to still work part-time at a research center called the Great Lakes Forestry Center, and continue to do my PhD full time. So the program experience, it's based on field courses and field work, but there is an opportunity to do international field courses in Costa Rica. It changes year by year. Here you actually see a shot of me, and I'm there in the middle, attending the Canadian Urban Forest Conference. And this just happened in October. We went to Winnipeg. And so I was actually able to, on top of the base funding that I received as a PhD student, I received an NSERC scholarship for urban forestry students it's called U4. And I was able to, get this funding as a way to make my PhD student life livable in Toronto. So they top you out with some money, but then they also provide money for you to go to a conference and for you to, exchange ideas with other academics, practitioners. And here's actually a shot with me and my some of my government colleagues. So it was only through U of T that I was able to get this job. And my supervisor and I have had productive conversations to ensure that, the work, the T opportunities or the part-time working opportunities you could get through the government complement your PhD or your MSc work, and it doesn't necessarily take away from it. So I've enjoyed my experience as a master's student here, and I've certainly enjoyed it as a PhD student. And I found like the general pathway is fairly straightforward on the outset of completing your doctoral or doctorate, excuse me. So after you complete your courses, and as I said, those can be courses that can improve your technical capacity or just your general knowledge. You have an oral exam, and then you become a doctoral candidate. As John mentioned, that oral exam often happens in the first year or two of your program. And then you're expected to complete field work or lab work. And so there are a variety of labs in forestry, and each lab is represented by a professor. And so my lab, for instance, is the Urban Forest Landscapes Lab, Urban Forest and Settled Landscape Lab. And then ideally, you have a bunch of publication-worthy chapters for within your PhD. So you have 3 chapters with your PhD, ideally 3 papers. And then that 4th chapter is your thesis, bringing all 3 of your chapters together. But along the way of completing your PhD, you want to get those publications in because it provides further evidence of your professionalism and your ability to become a doctor, essentially. And on top of writing in those publications, then eventually defending your work in your final thesis, something that's integral throughout this entire process is building networks and collaborating. And I find that whether it was the master's program or the PhD program, U of T is fantastic, and your professors are fantastic at finding ways to ensure that you're collaborating with who you need to collaborate with, or they'll point you in the direction of the network you need to ingratiate yourself in to ensure that while you're completing this research, while you're completing perhaps this theoretical research, it's standing in a practical sense, and it's informed by who you're collaborating with. So often with my government work, that can sometimes inform my research work in terms of, okay, is my research actually reflective of what's occurring on the ground or occurring in real time, or is it too theoretical? So I found that it's quite integral to collaborate. And as I'm also part of the Forest Graduate Students Association here at Daniels, and I'm the research representative there. And I found that it creates a community sense when you take the initiative to build these networks and build these connections. And I find that like the experience at U of T to be quite rewarding. And I'm still only in my 2nd year as a PhD student. So I hope I continue to feel this way, and I know I will. But you just got to ensure that you're getting your vision lined up within your research process. And as John said, like it's integral to establish a relationship with your supervisor, because they'll often help steer the ship when it comes to who to network with, who to collaborate with, etc. So yeah, defend your work, graduate. Thank you for your time here. This is just a little headshot of the forestry building going in. U of T at Forestry is one of the oldest programs in Canada, And so I thought it was fitting to leave it off there. Thank you for your time, and please let me know if you have any questions.
And likewise, I'm still here. So if any of you have questions for me, let me know. And you can also type them in the chat here. I think it's still working if you want to, if you feel more comfortable with that. If not, that's it for today. Oops. So if we don't see any questions here, we will check. Oh, here we go. Okay, here's a question from Adrian. How many days a week would it be necessary to be at Daniels in person? That's a good question. And one that has probably changed a bit since the pandemic. James and I were talking before this session started about how he and I were, when he was doing his master's work, he was taking a course with me, and we spent a lot of time on Zoom. I found that even since the pandemic has waned, there's a bit more of that because everybody got used to it, and which is a good thing. Is that sometimes I meet with my students on Zoom, which allows people to prioritize, well, schedule their time so they're not always coming and going if they're commute far. So. But I can't answer this question with a number because it depends on your supervisor and the nature of your work. I think it probably varies a lot from some people who are, in some cases, people, say if you've got a heavily lab-based thesis and you work in a large lab where there's kind of a lot of moving parts and people who depend on each other, then you might be expected to be in regularly. On the other hand, a lot of PhD students do research largely on their own, obviously collaborating with their supervisor, and that allows for more flexibility. But if I had to guess, I would say that the average PhD student is in maybe most days of the week, but would feel fine working at home a day or two a week. I don't know, James, you might want to speak to your own experience.
Yeah, I find that for integral conversations, like let's say you're meeting with your supervisor, or you're meeting some folks you want to interview, I think establishing that relationship in person is paramount because it kind of sets the stage for how you're going to collaborate moving forward. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean you have to meet with you're not going to meet your supervisor every day during your PhD. That's first off. Second off, when you're immersing yourself at the actual forestry building, it's helpful to have other folks doing something similar to you. And just with my own experience, like my first year, last year, I didn't go to campus as much as I could have. I went about like 2 times, and I find this year I'm attending in-person stuff more often, and it's improved my productivity. And so that being said, as John mentioned, it's very contextual. So depending if your field work, takes you out of the city and you need to be in some remote area, for me, my field work can be done on my computer. But I would say that the resources, like Daniels itself has a library, and these librarians are very helpful, especially at the beginning of your research, in terms of directing you to where you need to go to do a literature review or access some data. So I found that the more effort you put in towards ensuring that your work is optimized, the better. And often that means going in person a bit more often to access the resources, because there's a variety of resources within forestry that are best taken advantage of in person, as I mentioned. But there are students that do this work remotely and will still get it done, but it's very contextual, and so it's hard to kind of put a rule of thumb and say like, oh, you need to be on campus at least 3 times a week. It really depends.
Yeah, let me just add a bit more. One more. Well, one more factor is that that it changes over time. So when you start, you obviously have to start taking courses. You have to be present for the courses. When you start, you need to be there more often. But towards the end, when you're sort of, squirreled away in your office, work, writing, that could be done, at home or even remotely. So it really depends. Adrian, I wonder if you want, you could just tell me what you're thinking, why you asked that question, why, and maybe I could give you a more specific answer.
Yeah, for sure. So I live in Paris, with my current living arrangement, and the cost of living in Toronto, there is no feasible way for me to move. And so the question stems from wondering if it's even feasible.
Do you mean Paris, Ontario, or Paris, France?
Paris, Ontario. So via
Okay.
GO train, it's all fine, but
Yeah.
upwards of 2 days a week for more than the first year kind of gets,
Yeah. Well, yeah. So first of all, with cost of living, as I mentioned when I was going through the funding package, you could potentially negotiate a higher salary, right? Like, considerably higher, depending, on how much money the supervisor has, and how competitive you are, that kind of thing. That's one thing. The second thing, you can commute, from, I guess you could commute fairly reasonably from Paris. So again, that would be just something you want to ask your supervisor. If you told them your situation and you said, I think I could come in twice a week for the first, couple of years, and then, maybe less after that, then they could just say what they, it's, so that doesn't seem outside the realm of possible, but you might get some reluctance, like, okay, is this going to really work, right? So it mostly depends, I think, on the fit. Like, if you have a really keen supervisor, they're going to try and make it work. They're keen to have you.
Sure.
And then I think it more becomes a question of your personal satisfaction with that experience. Not having regular interaction with fellow graduate students, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and then independent of that specific context, there's like the TA opportunities and also scholarships, particularly as you get into the program itself. The School of Graduate Studies has many scholarships in place, whether they're NSERC or SHIRK, and these are scholarships that are on top of your base funding, right? So your tuition gets covered, which is about 9,300, and then there's that base funding of 10,200. And then on top of that, you receive scholarships, which you can receive, X amount of money every 3 months, and that will be like topping up the base package. And so that can also help with kind of like living in Toronto, is getting these scholarships, and depending on your research, like, even though I'm more social science based, I didn't actually go through SHIRK, which most social scientists do. I actually went through NSERC because there's more money in NSERC, and if I've framed my social science work right, it can be catered towards the hard science. And so there's ways to kind of mediate the cost of living independent of the kind of base funding that's available. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Nobody else has one. I'll ask one last question. Maybe from both of your experiences, what sort of careers do people tend to get into? It's probably widely based because you have so many researchers and different streams, but what have you noticed?
Yeah, well, so obviously, a lot of people get into research because they want to do research, in an academic setting. That's the kind of the standard thing. And I assume you kind of know what's involved there. I mean, that might range a bit from other, big universities, getting a professor job at other big universities, but also includes, smaller, colleges, that kind of thing. But I think what you're probably getting at is what other kind of research positions are there outside of academia? And the standard one would be being a researcher, say in a either a provincial or a federal agency. I can think of numerous people who went on to do research for on the province of Ontario in for example, in silviculture, and it's similar to what I do, but it's in a working in a government research lab, often in collaboration with academics. But obviously, the research is it's funded differently. It's funded. You don't in those cases you don't necessarily apply for funding. You kind of have a research budget, or you apply internally. It's not external. You don't necessarily have graduate students, although you might sort of be a co-supervisor of a student who's doing a degree in a university. But I think the most important thing is the research is usually very applied compared to what you might see in an academic setting. So that's an example, and that would also. So I gave you a provincial example. So there are provincial research labs. Another one would be the federal equivalent of that, federal research labs, Canadian Forest Service, for example. And then beyond that, it's kind of it's hard to describe. I'm thinking of I have a former PhD student who works for an environmental consulting firm but it's focused on bioenergy. I have a former postdoc who works for the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. So it's pretty varied. The big difference between the academic track and the non-academic track is it's very clear what you have to do to succeed on the academic track. You need to do the PhD, then you need to do a postdoc, and then you need to get the job, and then to get tenure you need to, and that's all very clear. Although it's challenging, it's competitive, and some people end up getting a little discouraged or whatever. It's often one of the issues is that the time it takes, but you spend 4 or 5 years doing the PhD, then you got to do a postdoc for another several years, and then depending on your age when you start, you may sort of already have, say, a family or something, and then you've got a spouse who also needs a job, and if that spouse is also looking for an academic job, then it's hard to find 2 academic jobs. So there's reasons that people are sometimes reluctant to pursue that. And then obviously it makes sense to consider a non-academic job. And the difference there is that it's not really clear what the path is. Like, how do you land a job at the Canadian Forest Service? I mean, it's similar. You start the research and you do it, but it's those jobs are a little, I guess there aren't as many of them. They might be less competitive, but it's, because there aren't as many of them, it's not clear exactly what the best strategy to take from the beginning is. Did that help? I don't know if that may address your question. Okay. I don't know if James, you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that after my master's, I worked for the Canadian Forest Service for 2 years full-time in the National Capital Region. And now I'm still working for the Canadian Forest Service part-time, of course, and within the Great Lakes Forestry Center. And that's just to show that you don't have to wait till you're done your degree, you're done your PhD, or you're done your MSc to make these connections and to think about these things. And that, yeah, like doing your PhD or your MSc is going to open up a lot of doors when it comes to either working at the private sector or the public sector, or John even mentioning becoming a consultant. And so I think it's a matter of having that vision and seeing like what caters towards your needs, what caters towards your fiscal needs as well. And so it's really helped me to still have like a part-time job while doing my PhD on top of having these opportunities to TA as well. And so there's just a variety of moving pieces that if you move them correctly, ideally, you're not facing any financial pressures or any even pressures to get a job right away after you graduate, because you're doing that work already throughout your degree. Thanks. And thanks for the questions,
I
Adrian.
would just add that James's situation is not necessarily typical. Students, I think the average student doesn't have they might have a part-time job, like, a barista or something, but they don't have a part-time job that, the average student doesn't have a part-time job that demands a lot, not only demands a lot of their time or mental energy. Although maybe James is going to contradict what I said, but I think the average student is, James is a bit fortunate, I would say. So let's I wouldn't plan on that working out exactly that way. All right. Yeah, it looks like and I don't see any other questions here. Any other questions, including from Adrian? If you still have some, feel free. Nope. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, and thanks, James, for giving the student perspective. That was helpful. And we'll see you all later.